Fractal Enigma Audio Previews and Stories presents Maple and Moth by Ames Willow. Chapter 1. The fairy lights were going to be perfect. Aiden Parker stood on the stepladder in the front window of Maple and Moth, a tangle of copper wire and tiny glass bulbs draped over his shoulders like a glittering scarf. His breath fogged in the cold air. The ancient radiator was losing its battle against December, but he barely noticed. He was too busy imagining how this would look once the sun set. Warm, inviting, magical. The kind of window display that made people stop, smile, and think, I want to go in there. The kind of thing that would prove to everyone back in Boston, to his parents, to his former boss, to himself, that he hadn't made a mistake. He wound another strand around the vintage wooden ladder he'd positioned as the display's centerpiece, then stepped back to assess. The lights blinked in a cheerful, rapid pattern, reflecting off the mason jars of cinnamon sticks and the hand-lettered chalkboard sign that read, Local. Cozy, yours. It was a little much, maybe, but much was kind of his brand. Through the window, Main Street stretched out in postcard-perfect Vermontness. Brick storefronts with cheerful awnings, antique lampposts strung with evergreen wreaths, the kind of small-town charm that had made him hand over his entire savings account and sign a 5-year lease on a building that probably violated several modern safety codes. The shop smelled like fresh paint, coffee beans, and cinnamon, exactly as he'd planned. Everything was coming together. His gaze drifted to the shop next door. Lawson's Hardware and Supply. It looked like it had been there since the town was founded. All dark wood, institutional green paint, and a window display that could generously be described as functional. A handwritten sign advertised snow shovels. Another promoted rock salt. There were no fairy lights, no aesthetic, no joy. Aiden felt a small, smug spark in his chest. He was going to be so much better at this. The sharp jingle of his shop bell made him jump. He turned, wobbling slightly on the ladder, and his heart did something complicated in his chest. The man standing in his doorway was imposing. That was the word. Not tall exactly, but solid. The kind of build that came from actual labor, not a gym membership. He wore a flannel shirt over a thermal, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms that looked like they could snap a 2x4 in half. His beard had just enough salt and pepper to suggest he was older than Aiden, but not old. 40, maybe? The lines around his eyes said he'd spent a lot of time squinting into the sun or frowning at incompetence. Right now, he was squinting at the fairy lights. Aiden's voice came out higher than he'd intended. Hi, can I help you? The man's gaze flicked from the lights to Aiden, and there was something deeply unimpressed in his warm brown eyes. When he spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like distant thunder or old wood settling. You're giving my saw blades a headache. Aiden blinked. What? The man nodded at the window. The lights, they're flashing into my shop. It's like working inside a disco ball. Oh. Aiden's excitement deflated like a punctured balloon. Oh, I wasn't trying to... It's a fire hazard, the man continued, his tone flat and practical. All those bulbs on one extension cord. Old building like this, you're asking for trouble. Aiden's face went hot. He scrambled off the ladder, nearly tripping over the bottom rung, and had to grab the window frame to steady himself. Sorry, I didn't think I can turn them down, or... But the man was already turning to leave. Just keep it reasonable, he said over his shoulder, and then the bell jingled again, and he was gone. Aiden stood there, surrounded by his beautiful, perfect fire hazard fairy lights, and felt like the stupidest person alive. Through the window, he watched the man disappear back into Lawson's Hardware and Supply. The door closed behind him with the kind of solid, no-nonsense thunk that made Aiden's trendy glass door feel flimsy by comparison. He looked at his lights. They blinked back at him, cheerful and oblivious. His throat felt tight. This was supposed to be his fresh start, his proof. 3 months ago, he'd been in Boston, designing marketing campaigns for a tech startup that had laid him off via Zoom. Before that, he'd spent 2 years in a cramped apartment with a boyfriend who decided Aiden was too much, too anxious, too dreamy, too something. His parents had been sympathetic but skeptical when he'd announced he was moving to Vermont to open a craft and coffee shop. His mother had actually said the words, "Well, if it doesn't work out, you can always come home." He wasn't going home, but standing here, in his half-finished shop, with the grumpy hardware store owner's words echoing in his head, he felt very small and very young, and very much like the kind of person who thought fairy lights could solve everything. His phone buzzed. A text from his father. "How's the big opening prep going?" Aiden stared at it, then shoved the phone back in his pocket without answering. The sun had set by the time Aiden climbed back up the ladder. The shop was dark except for the glow of the fairy lights, which, he had to admit, really were reflecting pretty aggressively into the hardware store next door. He could see the effect through the glass. Flickering, insistent, impossible to ignore. Shit. He started unwinding the strands, his fingers clumsy with cold and frustration. The copper wire caught on the ladder rungs. One of the bulbs popped with a sad little tink and went dark. He cursed under his breath. This was supposed to be his thing, his vision. He'd spent weeks planning this window display, sketching it out in his moleskin notebook, researching the exact warm white color temperature that would feel cozy without being clinical. He'd imagined people walking by, stopping, pulling out their phones to take pictures. #ShopLocal. #VermontVibes. #Maple and Moth. Instead, he'd annoyed the one person in town who actually seemed to know what he was doing. Aiden sat down on the ladder, the fairy lights pooling in his lap like a defeated Christmas decoration. The shop smelled good, at least. The coffee beans he'd scattered in decorative bowls were doing their job, and the walls looked great, painted in that soft, mossy green he'd agonized over. The shelves were stocked with hand-poured candles and locally made ceramics and all the other carefully curated things he'd convinced himself people in a small Vermont town would want. But what if they didn't? What if his mother was right, and he was just playing at this, and in 6 months he'd be back in Boston, sleeping in his childhood bedroom, fielding pitying looks from everyone who'd watched him fail? His chest felt tight. He pulled out his phone and opened Instagram. His last post, a photo of the shop's exterior with the caption, "Dreams take work, but they're worth it," had 63 likes. His friend Mara from design school had commented, "Obsessed, can't wait to visit." But she'd said the same thing when he'd moved in with his ex, and she'd never actually made the trip. Aiden closed the app. Through the window, he could see Main Street settling into evening. The antique lampposts glowed softly, their wreaths swaying in the wind. A couple walked by, bundled in matching scarves, laughing about something. They didn't even glance at his shop. He looked at the fairy lights in his lap, then at the window, then at Lawson's hardware and supply. The lights were off now. The man, his new nemesis apparently, had gone home. Aiden stood up, his legs stiff, and started winding the lights back onto their spool. He'd use them somewhere else, somewhere less aggressive, maybe draped over the coffee bar, or in the back corner where they'd add ambiance without declaring war. He wasn't giving up. He was compromising. That was different. By the time he finished, it was nearly 9 o'clock. His hands were cramping, and he was pretty sure he'd skipped both lunch and dinner. The shop looked emptier without the lights in the window, but it also looked more intentional, more curated. He told himself that was a good thing. He grabbed his coat and scarf, both thrifted, both chosen for their cozy New England aesthetic, and locked up. Main Street was quiet now, just the hiss of wind through the bare trees and the distant rumble of a snowplow. The temperature had dropped hard, that bone-deep cold that made his breath visible in sharp puffs. He glanced at Lawson's hardware and supply one more time. The building was dark, solid, utterly indifferent to his existence. Tomorrow, Aiden muttered to himself, pulling his scarf tighter. Tomorrow will be better. He wasn't sure he believed it, but he had to try.